I would now like to introduce Associate Professor Chris Short. And Chris is Associate Professor at the University of Gloucestershire in Environmental Governance with teaching and research interests in the relationship between various different land uses, communities, policies, as well as innovations that can result from local decision making. So very much what Patricia has just been talking about, actually, you're doing very much the kind of practical based side of that research. Chris's research for the last 25 years has mainly been focused on changes in agriculture and activities that enhance the environment, but also how people actually engage with nature and trying to develop those inclusive solutions to the complex issues for the UK government departments and also the European Commission. Chris is absolutely a recognised expert in integrated catchment manager within the UK and the EU, but also landscape scale management and nature-based solutions. So over to you, Chris. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Juliana. You really go for it on the introductions. I hardly recognise myself. It's great to be here this morning and this afternoon now, and I've been thankful to be able to join in some of the talks already. So it's been really interesting. So for me, my title is I'm looking at decarbonisation, as many people have, but I'm looking at it in slightly different angles. So this idea of natural capital, finance and nature-based solutions, and what does all this mean for the rural economy? So to give you a flavour of what's coming, I'll talk a little bit about NICRE, some of the background, how we came to be in this space, looking at this work from this perspective. In terms of my talk, what we mean by decarbonisation and how this links to natural capital. And if you're not familiar, I'll also introduce what we mean by natural capital. So where does finance come into all of this? And then we'll finish up with what the opportunities are for the rural economy. So NICRE, the National Innovation Centre for Rural Enterprise, is a Research England funded project, 4-year project. It's a collaboration between the University of Newcastle, where we're working with the business school there and the Centre for Rural Economy, Warwick, University of Warwick, where it's the business school again, and CCRI, we're based at the University of Gloucestershire, and we're also pulling in some folk from the Royal Agricultural University. So that little diagram below there, you can see the 3 work streams. We want to strengthen the evidence base. This is also crucially linked to the second work stream, the green circle, where we're trying to catalyse innovation and enterprise. So we're working with business sector, trying to tackle those real world issues. And then the third one is that this is here to inform policy, enterprise and support. So we're delighted to work with CREST on this part of the seminar. Contribution, I think it's the first of a number of connections. So this is all good. And those 4 bullet points on the right are the themes. So we're looking at productive rural, smart rural, and this natural capital work comes under the resilient rural aspect. And then there's a sort of engagement theme too. And you can keep in touch with NICRE if you want to on the usual channels. And part of the thinking about this, so NICRE came about because you sort of get the feeling that at the moment we just need to expect the unexpected. There's a need maybe for local, rural to become more resilient. And that's ecological resilience in relation to biodiversity loss and the impacts of extreme weather around climate change. It's social resilience in terms of how our communities are going to tackle those changes, which have been talked about this morning, and economic resilience too. because of the changes which are coming and we can see coming. Also, you know, we wouldn't have known 2 years ago about the strains that have been put on international or national systems. Issues around energy, which we've been talking about, changes within agriculture, in retail, etc., and labour, and all the things, and some of the amazing things we've been listening about. The examples been had around energy and such like. So there's just increased churn, disruption, and uncertainty, and what that provides then is also opportunities. And there's undoubtedly increased interest as financial aspects around the decarbonisation. I'll talk about that as we go through. So what do we mean by decarbonisation in the context of I'm talking about this? So this is about reducing our CO2, greenhouse gas emissions, as they go into the atmosphere. And this isn't fanciful anymore. We know net zero greenhouse gas emissions have to be cut by 2050. It's written in law. And the NFU has called for net zero in agriculture by 2040 as an aspiration. So this is going to mean methane mitigation, fossil fuel replacements, precision farming, tree planting, improved soil health, etc. And we can talk about carbon sequestration, nature recovery, renewables in a part 2. So that's all part of the mix, and as much of what we've been this gathering's been talking about so far. It'd be interesting just to pause and reflect back on COP26 and the decarbonisation there. And this was lucky enough to take part in a meeting on Wednesday when we were doing this as part of a project called the Farm Soil Carbon Code, Environment Agency Investment Readiness Funded project, and with SRUC, University of Leeds, and the Soil Science Alliance. So what was interesting with this COP compared to others is there was much more attention paid to agriculture. A pledge for a 75% reduction in its carbon emissions by 2030. Much like some of the other ones that we talked about this morning, that changing around away from fossil fuels, this will be challenging. But there was also, in a sense, importance around data collection and results, in the sense that money, we'll come on to that, the desire that whatever money there is, it follows those green initiatives which are based on data. And there was some agreement around global carbon trading, this Article 6, and that's important too for making sure that there's certainty, transparency and accountability in this space. So if we look at the UK, then what we need to be thinking about here is net zero. This is our net zero strategy, Build Back Greener. BES published it in October this year, so last month. And it's very clear in here that the natural capital aspects, nature-based solutions have space. They get mentioned 15 times. There's other carbon reduction techniques. They're important for removing greenhouse gas from there. They're important for increasing our resilience to climate change. And it's possibly the first time that you could find them in things outside of some of the DEFRA publications. So it's a nod to emerging markets. So the Woodland Carbon Code, for example, gets a mention, and that's possibly the most well-established one. There's a Peat Carbon Code 2. And through the nature-based solutions, then soil has a role to play, particularly in the sense of the, for example, the Investment Readiness Fund project I referred to, the Farm Soil Carbon Code, and that's embryonic and building. We now have an Environment Act, and that is a drive to fund and secure natural capital. nature recovery. So this is all heading in the right direction, and the direction we're heading is that we're going to shift towards a low carbon, sustainable rural economy. I promised earlier that I would introduce natural capital, because it may be a term which isn't familiar to everybody. It's systems thinking, thankfully, and by that I mean it's not linear, it's not siloed. The idea, in a sense, is that you include nature fully whenever we make decisions, all sorts of decisions, infrastructure decisions, investment decisions, etc. And the reason that it's come about is that it's a pushback against gross domestic product, in a sense. So because it's measuring, what it's accounting for is it's measuring the right things, or it's measuring all the things. So at the moment, GDP is a little bit like the cartoon. The two chaps on the left in the higher end of the boat are saying, yeah, great, we've got a fantastic GDP. Look at the way we're our finances are increasing, X% growth, everything's fine. But that growth is dependent on the state of natural resources to a greater or lesser degree. And this is the point, that people don't realise their connection to natural resources and how this comes about. So the guys in the right, the boat doing the bailing out, they're recognising, in a sense, the harm that's been happening, but it's not taken into account. So we need the whole boat to be assessed, and that's really what natural capital is about. And it has more traction than its predecessors. So its main predecessor was ecosystem services, and that's what I replicate there in the infographic at the bottom. When I say it has more traction, because I was around when early meetings with ecosystem services, and it was difficult to get people outside of DEFRA, Natural England, to join, because they didn't see the relevance. The word ecosystem put them off. So natural capital is the stocks, that left-hand box. The bigger your stock, the bigger your clump of capital, then the more that is going to flow towards ecosystem services, and in that sense, the more value you get. It's quite a simplistic infographic. We can argue about which way the arrows go. I don't like them running in one direction. But what's happening is that new policies, new interest around natural capital is growing. There's a paper by Mays which looks at how it could influence UK decision making. 85 public bodies would currently need to consider in some shape or form their link to natural capital and use natural capital accounting to do that. And we know that financial, or our share have financial interest, in a sense, is growing. So let's look at that in a little bit more detail. So natural capital and finance, there is space for both public and private. We know that public, it's important. The ELMS, sorry, so many abbreviations, the Environmental Land Management Programme, currently being developed by DEFRA, has as its mantra public money for public goods. And this is the reshaping of our agricultural support, no longer for passively owning land, but for undertaking actions to deliver public goods. So that's pure public money. There is some blending. A good example, which I'll look at later, is biodiversity net gain and how that can be handled. It's not, yes, it's sort of blended. It's not a merging of public-private. That hasn't quite come about. When it happens, they tend to run in parallel. But private sector is also moving fast in this arena. Some of this is commercial. They're looking for early money, be there quick and have those early gains. Others is charitable or interest driven. They want traction, they want change, they want certainty. This was a major issue at COP26. You couldn't have helped if you'd watched any of it being struck by the Maldives representative doing his presentation based in the sea. And a Bolivian delegate said net zero is carbon colonialism. And there have been thoughts and chapters around land grab and associated to. In other words, everyone trying to get the piece of the pie so that they can offer up their carbon offsets. And people doing it that way in a sense because they want control. So what this suggests is that there are darker sides to this. Not everybody is comfortable with this idea of profiting from nature. Particularly if you're doing that profiting when you're in some sense you're anonymous, so linked to hedge funds, pension pots, without any actual attachment or connection with that landscape. And that's me in that picture. But I tell myself, this perhaps is an intermediary step, this idea of natural capital, creating and separating it off, engaging in a discussion. George Monbiot says we shouldn't be doing this because we're engaging in a discussion with the very people whose system we want to change. You don't change a system by participating. I'm not sure you change a system by not participating. So maybe we should see it as an intermediate step towards a true system thinking approach. Perhaps we should count the right things, focus on that positive and support recovery. That money would be invested anyway, somewhere. Perhaps if it's invested in nature, there'll be some benefits that will support that change. So just to illustrate that this is a very active and challenging market, here is just some examples. So gentle farming. This is a young entrepreneurial farmer from southeast of England, and just clipped it from his website or their website. UK's first soil carbon standard. Great. I can't fault his desire to get in there. And the other half of me says, well, let's just have a look at this and see if it does what it says on the tin. Soil Capital, the one in the corner, said join farmers earning carbon payments each year, advertising for UK, France and Belgium. Again, great, really good initiative. But what are we buying? Or what are they offering? And are you sure? And what's the certification? Also launched recently, Rewilding Britain, Rewilding the Rural Economy, their pitch to reshape some of this thinking and countryside. Soil is challenging. There is no existing protocol. There are 6 international ones. None of them would work in the UK context. They're mainly from Australia, America, Kenya, etc. There is actually a lack of agreement on the permanence of carbon in soils. A chap on this meeting Wednesday was saying that it has to be, in order to be permanent, it needs to have been there for 25 years. Anything before that, then that carbon is moving, it's liable. There's a massive challenge around measuring and monitoring, a lack of agreement. How far do you go before you start measuring? What do you measure? Do you measure the biodiversity in the soil or not? So we need to sort this out and resolve this, because most investors and providers need some sort of reassurance. They need reassurance, not some sort. They need a robust reassurance. They need evidence. So they need to, before you put your money in, are you going to gain that return? If you're a farmer, land manager, in a sense, providing this, do you want to understand what it is that you're in for, how long you're in for it, and what is expected of you? So that's that one, and it will happen. but I'm probably a bit more cautious approach than some. And actually, I'd just say we were working with Stratton Parker, who's an industrial member of NICRE. Yeah, and they're part of that space. They're offering accounts to their clients because their clients want that, but they want to be able to do it with certainty. So let's look at what we could do then on biodiversity net gain. So last example. Many of you are probably familiar with this, maybe more so than me. But basically, my understanding is this calculation of new housing developments. So the idea is that there won't be no net loss from the housing development, and that's a standard metric which government has made mandatory within the market. So any development will have to determine what that metric comes out with, and those that outcome is then invested in selected projects in order to secure a biodiversity gain to mitigate the loss of that development. It's for the developer to choose, and they can choose a national or a local option. So just to illustrate that, so you have a buyer here on the right. If they want a national offer, then they just go through a trading platform, and that trading platform then manages that offer. So a single organisation could invest in multiple projects with those offers. The trading platform reports back to the buyer, and their offers, so Entrade or Environment Bank, offer this type of service. Within Gloucestershire, I sit on the Gloucestershire Local Nature Partnership, board member, and we've been looking at this and thinking, is there a different offer? Can we have a place-based alternative? So we're in the process of establishing the Gloucestershire Nature and Climate Fund. Because the key finding we felt was that of proximity. So it's important, according to the feedback we've been having from developers and others involved around local authorities, that biodiversity net gain is generated and delivered in the same space. And there's a connection between the projects, housing developments where they take place, as well as to where the projects are. So we're going to form the process of forming a new organisation, and we're very keen that this is evidence-led, transparent process. And the hope is that it will provide a new opportunity with a wide range of benefits to rural enterprises, not just farmers and land managers, but the whole of the rural economy. So we're here. You can see biodiversity net gain in the middle there, but potentially there are other ones. Community investment levy, major infrastructure projects, such like other offsetting, so of private sector or voluntary, etc. And you can create a number of wetlands, natural flood management, amenity space, habitat creation. So we think that this sort of investment in nature-based solutions, as that green cluster would count, this warrants consideration. The whole of these will be in local area. The Nature and Climate Fund would operate in that middle tier, evidence-based, transparent governance, offering interaction between those different investors. But that has an interesting twist on governance, because there's a need for certainty from those who are buying and investing. In a sense, what are they investing in? The offer from the fund needs to be robust because it's a choice on behalf of the developer. We may or may not be content with what the metric comes up with in terms of the total pot. And we have to accept that nature-based solutions has at the moment less evidence in terms of what constitutes good or success. And that does make this issue of transparency quite challenging. And how does it happen? What does it look for in the longer term? But we know that there's this back to this huge, or the huge churn and uncertainty within the sector. I'm ahead of time, so I can insert a little extra here. I've taken it out because I thought I might be running out. But another piece of work that we've been doing on NICRE is looking at agricultural transition. So we know in the sector that there's loss of the basic payment scheme, which was the flat rate payment for land. In Gloucestershire alone, each year that was 40 million. Now, if that was a single industry in a single location on an industrial estate, there'd be some special measures to cover and impact, take that coming out of the local economy. But because it's spread across the county in a whole range of small or micro and small SMEs, it's not possible to do that type of support. But we know that those businesses will be responding in a whole range in different ways. So maybe this is offer those nature-based solutions potentially, or this carbon sector is something that would that is alternative for those sectors. And we know that there's a whole range of ancillary industries which are linked to them and knock on. But we do need to look for some sort of basis and principle to build on there. So potentially, could we look at the emerging environmental and social governance coming out of the financial sector? I mean, let's be honest, they started from a very low base, but some of the material coming out of ESG is useful. You've also got the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. Again, potentially interesting steps and thinking for developing there. So future considerations. This could be a step change in how we think of and our role of nature. It's certainly challenging in a number of ways. The place of nature within our setting is all the more important, and this next decade is going to be really fascinating. We need to make sure that there's those opportunities, and we have evidence of opportunities in rural areas, a range of them. It could reshape the way in which we link to cities. It could be the way in which rural areas link to each other and within each other. One thing I'm really clear about for me is engaging in this is that there should be and needs to be the potential for reducing existing inequalities. A concern I have is it's quite easy to see how the existing inequalities will be reinforced by some of the steps and progress which is happening. And that's certainly a key aspect of NICRE. Some of the work we've done on levelling up, the levelling up agenda shows, one, that rural is neglected, and two, that if it isn't taken, then those inequalities will be reinforced. So we need to broaden the benefits. But we also know that identifying these opportunities remains a challenge. The first challenge is actually making the case and getting the evidence across, engaging. This isn't the most straightforward thing to talk about. And then those challenges which are highlighted around permanence, transparency, and identifying, so we're sure, what success looks like. But I'm positive because events like this and others show that there's a mutual benefit when we share ideas and our thinking, and we can collectively begin to quite rapidly, hopefully, sort this out. So one last thing for me is just to mention just one thing. This is a NICRE net zero campaign, trying to encourage this swapping of ideas between rural business communities. So levelling the work on net zero showed that rural companies are more likely to consider these issues, more willing to tackle them than their urban counterparts. So 45% of firms said they were looking at the rural environmental implications of their own decisions. So small steps, big way to go, and that's it from me. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you, Chris. Small steps, long way to go. Yeah, I don't think anybody could actually coin it better than that, could they? Actually, thank you very much for sharing. I think one of your opening slides was on the strains on national and international systems, linked to resilience, and I can't remember the other. Was it uncertainty? Trying to remember it all and can't. Try to form an acronym in my head so I wouldn't forget. But also to see that all the good work that you're doing in Gloucestershire nationally and with NICRE as well is also taking into consideration here all the government policies, the strategies, the regulations that are all coming out, and all seem to be moving in the right environmental direction, or most of them for one, which is quite enlightening, and how you're integrating those into the work you do, and especially around the nature-based solutions work that you're doing. Really interesting what you mentioned about ecosystem services, because yeah, I know we refer to it as natural sort of capital now, but how the business sector are really focusing on ecosystems network, and they've coined the kind of term themselves, and it means exactly the same as biological ecosystems in terms of those network of organizations, and where all the kind of, I guess, all the individual businesses are involved in delivering that product, that service, and they're creating that kind of constantly evolving relationships. Yeah, and which is just the same as a biological system. So all these terms are they cross over all the time and mean very different things to different people. Anyway, on that note, Kat is here. Otherwise, I will just carry on talking. But thank you very much for your presentation, and it's over to Kat for the Q&A with Patricia and yourself.